The grain elevator in Harlan County, Kentucky had been burning for 11 minutes when the roof section collapsed and took 3,000 square feet of corrugated steel down onto the conveyor pit below. The debris pile sat 32 feet deep in a shaft that hadn't seen open air since 1961. Kentucky State Fire Marshal's office declared the pit a structural hazard by noon. No civilian access, no recovery equipment until the integrity of the remaining walls could be assessed. That assessment took 4 days. By the time the construction crew from Whitfield Industrial got on site, the debris had settled into a configuration that had already defeated one plan on paper and was working on a second. The issue wasn't the weight. The issue was geometry. The collapsed roof section had folded into itself and wedged against the east wall of the pit at an angle that made vertical lifting impossible without first breaking the steel free from the wall. And breaking it free without the right equipment would bring the wall down on top of whoever was working the cables. Whitfield brought in a Liebherr LTM 1508. One mobile crane. $680,000 of German engineering. The operator was a man named Craig Faust out of Lexington, who had spent 19 years in commercial heavy lifting and had the certificates laminated on the visor of his truck cab to prove it. Craig walked the perimeter of the pit for 40 minutes with his site foreman, Denny Marsh, ran his calculations on a tablet computer, and came back to the Whitfield project manager with a single-page summary that said, in professional language, what plain language would have said in 6 words. He couldn't do it. The crane's boom couldn't achieve the lateral angle required to pull the wedge steel clear of the east wall without exceeding the rated working load at that extension. He could bring more equipment. He could bring a second crane, work a coordinated 2-point lift. The additional mobilization would take 9 days and cost Whitfield an estimated $210,000 above the original contract. The grain elevator's owner, a third-generation farmer named Boyd Calhoun, stood at the edge of the pit in his good boots, the ones he'd worn thinking this would be a one-day problem, and looked down at the wreckage of something his grandfather had built in 1947. Boyd didn't say anything. He just put his cap back on and walked to his truck. If you appreciate stories about old iron and the men who keep it running, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read everyone. That afternoon, Boyd Calhoun drove 14 miles down Route 119 to a property outside the town of Everett's that most people in the county knew by reputation more than by sight. Rafe Holmes' place. 11 acres of bottomland that bordered Clover Fork Creek, half of it overgrown, the other half organized in a system that made sense only to the man who'd built it over 50 years of acquiring iron that nobody else wanted. There were trucks under tarps, engines on wooden pallets, wheels leaned against fence posts in rows that suggested a kind of sorting logic, though what that logic was, you'd have to ask Rafe. Rafe Holmes was 73 years old. He'd grown up on that property, the son of a man who'd worked the Wallens Creek mines until a roof fall in 1954 convinced him that underground work was a young man's mistake. His father had bought a flatbed truck and gone into the hauling business. Rafe had grown up riding in that flatbed, learning the roads of Harlan County before he could read them on a map. By the time he was 15, he could change a clutch. By 20, he was pulling disabled vehicles off mountain roads for cash. He never called it a business. He just showed up when people needed him. He'd married a woman named Cora in 1974. They'd raised 2 sons on that 11 acres. Cora passed in 2009. The sons had moved to Lexington and Knoxville respectively, called on Sundays, came home at Christmas, and understood that their father was not going to stop maintaining his iron just because they worried about him doing it alone. Boyd Calhoun found Rafe under the hood of a 1963 International Harvester, doing something with a valve cover gasket that required focus. Boyd waited. Rafe finished what he was doing, lowered the hood, wiped his hands on a rag that had been white in another decade, and looked at Boyd the way a man looks at someone who's driven out of his way on a weekday afternoon. Boyd explained the situation. The pit, the crane, the 9-day wait, and the $210,000 that came with it. Rafe listened without interrupting. "Walk me over there," Rafe said. "Right now? You got somewhere else to be?" They drove out to the elevator site in Boyd's truck. Rafe walked the pit perimeter twice, moving slowly, stopping at 3 points to look down at the angle of the wedge steel. He crouched at the northeast corner for a long moment, looking at the gap between the debris and the wall. He stood, looked at the wall's remaining structure above grade, looked at the access road, looked at the distance from the road to the pit edge. Craig Faust was still on site, reviewing revised calculations with Denny Marsh. He watched the old man in the canvas work coat walk the perimeter and didn't say anything until Rafe stopped near the crane's rigging position. "Help you?" Craig said. "Maybe," Rafe said. "What's your boom rated at 60 degrees lateral?" Craig looked at him. "Are you in the industry?" "I pull things for people." "Commercially?" Rafe looked at the pit. "That wedge section, you figure it at about 4 tons?" Craig's expression shifted slightly, the way a man's does when someone has just asked the exact question he'd been working on. 4.2 is my estimate. Why? Because if you break it from the wall before you try to lift it, you change your load geometry. You're not pulling at an angle anymore. You're pulling straight up. I need lateral force to break it from the wall in the first place, which creates the same problem. Not if you use the wall as your anchor point. Craig was quiet for a moment. You can't anchor to the wall. The wall's compromised. The wall above grade is compromised. Below grade, it's poured concrete backed by 40 feet of consolidated fill. There's a bolt pattern in the foundation course. I can see 4 anchor point from here. You run a snatch block system off the foundation bolts, apply lateral tension from below grade elevation. The wall gives you the mechanical advantage without loading the compromised section. Craig looked at Denny Marsh. Denny looked at the pit. "What equipment are you running?" Craig asked. 1949 Peterbilt wrecker with a Holmes 600 boom. She's got a worm drive winch and a 38-foot cable run. Craig almost smiled. Almost. In 1949 Peterbilt, the Holmes 600 was rated at what? 15,000-pound single-line pull? 18,000 on the rebuilt worm gear. I respooled with 3/4-inch Dyneema last spring. Working loads rated at 41,000 with a 4-part block. You rebuild a Holmes 600 worm gear. Had to. Couldn't find a replacement. Machined the new one myself. Craig looked at the pit again. He looked at Rafe's canvas coat, the boots that had walked every kind of terrain Harlan County had to offer, the hands that had machined a gear from raw stock in a barn workshop. He ran the load math in his head a second time. "Show me your rigging," Craig said. Boyd Calhoun drove Rafe back to his property. The 1949 Peterbilt sat in the east bay of the barn, under a canvas tarp that had been replaced 3 times since Rafe bought the truck at a Breathitt County salvage auction in 1988 for $425. The auctioneer at that sale had knocked it down fast, almost embarrassed to be asking for bids on something that had last worked a job site in 1971. 2 operators had looked at it and walked away. A scrapper had offered $180 for the metal weight. Rafe had offered $425 and taken it home on a borrowed trailer. That was 35 years ago. The Peterbilt sat in the barn, looking exactly like what it was. A truck that had been kept alive through mechanical understanding and patience, and a refusal to accept that old iron stops matching when new iron gets cheaper. The paint was the truck's 3rd coat, applied by Roller in 1997, a deep green that had faded to something more honest-looking than the original. The cab was cracked in one corner of the windshield where a tree branch had come through during a 2003 ice storm. Rafe had taped it from the inside with clear shipping tape and hadn't bothered to replace the glass because the tape held fine and replacement glass for a 1949 Peterbilt cost more than the problem warranted. The boom was the original Holmes 600, rebuilt twice, the second rebuild completed in the winter of 2019 when Rafe had taken the entire assembly apart at his barn and laid every component on a tarpaulin on the floor and inspected each one before deciding what stayed and what got remade. The worm gear housing had been rebored. The cable sheaves had been rebushed with bronze. The winch drum had been respooled. The hydraulic lines. The Peterbilt had no hydraulics on the boom, all manual cable operation, had been replaced with braided steel runs that Rafe had fabricated and terminated himself. Boyd Calhoun stood in the barn doorway and looked at the truck. "You think you can do it?" Boyd asked. Rafe pulled the tarp the rest of the way off and folded it over the hood of the International he'd been working on. "Start her up and find out," Rafe said. The Peterbilt's engine turned over on the 3rd crank. A deep, uneven rumble that smoothed out within 30 seconds into something steady. Rafe let it warm for 5 minutes, watching the gauges come up. Oil pressure at 62. Temperature climbing toward normal. The exhaust coming off the stack was clean. No blue smoke, no black. Just a diesel engine doing what it was built to do. Boyd watched from the doorway and didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. Either the old iron would do it or it wouldn't, and the man standing next to the Peterbilt with his hand on the cab door had already made his own calculation about which of those was true. Rafe drove the Peterbilt out of Everett's the next morning at 6:15 before the county road got any traffic. The truck moved the way old trucks move, not slow exactly, but deliberate. Each gear change a considered action, the engine note dropping and climbing in a pattern that hadn't changed in 75 years of that drivetrain doing its work. Rafe had loaded his rigging the night before. Chain, cable, snatch blocks, shackles, wooden cribbing cut from 4x6 oak stock, a come-along he'd owned since 1981. Everything worn, everything functional, nothing on that truck bed that hadn't earned its place through use. Boyd Calhoun met him at the elevator site at 7. Craig Faust's crew was already there. 3 operators and Denny Marsh, who'd shown up early the way men do when something is about to happen that they aren't certain about. Craig was at the pit edge with a cup of coffee, looking down at the wedged steel in the gray morning light. He heard the Peterbilt before he saw it. That engine note carried. Craig turned and watched the truck come up the access road and felt something he didn't have a professional term for. Not respect exactly. Not yet, but attention. The kind a man pays when something he'd categorized arrives and turns out to be more specific than the category suggested. Rafe parked 30 feet from the pit edge, set the brake, climbed down from the cab. He walked to the pit without greeting anyone and stood there looking at the steel for 2 minutes. Then he walked the perimeter again, this time with a tape measure, checking distances between the anchor bolt positions he'd identified the day before and the target rigging points on the debris below. Craig walked over. I ran your numbers last night. Rafe looked up from the tape measure. The foundation anchor concept is sound. Below-grade concrete is intact. I had my structural consultant pull the original elevator drawings from the county records office. Poured in 1947, reinforced 12-inch walls. The foundation course goes down 8 feet. The bolt pattern you saw is original anchor hardware from the elevator's conveyor mount. 5/8-inch galvanized rod set in epoxy. Rafe nodded. They built things to last in 47. I also ran the load sequence. If we apply lateral tension at the foundation anchors first, break the wedge from the east wall before any vertical load goes on, we change the lift geometry completely. Your 4-part block system takes the lateral pull. My crane takes the vertical once it's free. Craig paused. It should work. Should, Rafe said. It'll work if the steel releases clean. If it binds on the way out, we stop and reassess. Agreed. Craig looked at the Peterbilt, at the Holmes 600 boom, the cable drum, the rigging stacked in the bed. How long have you had that truck? Since '88. You rebuild the boom yourself? Twice. Craig was quiet for a moment. Then, my grandfather ran a 1951 Peterbilt out of Harlan. Cole Hall said those trucks would run until the roads wore out. Rafe looked at him. Your grandfather was right. They spent the next hour rigging. Rafe worked the foundation anchors himself, dropping into the pit on a rope ladder he'd brought from his barn, moving across the debris carefully, testing footing before committing weight. He was 73 years old doing this work, and nobody watching said a word about it, because watching him move made commentary unnecessary. He knew every foothold before he took it. He placed his chain anchors at 2 of the foundation bolt positions, ran his snatch blocks, tested the connections by hand, climbed back out. Denny Marsh handed him a water bottle at the top. Rafe took it, drank, handed it back. If you're hooked on this story, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. These old iron stories don't show up on the algorithm easily, and your support is what keeps them coming. Thank you. Craig's crew positioned the Liebherr at the north end of the pit for the vertical lift phase. They wouldn't engage until Rafe had broken the wedge free. The sequence was Rafe's load first, Craig's crane second. That had been agreed without much discussion. It followed from the physics, and both men understood the physics. Rafe positioned the Peterbilt at the pit's west edge, running his primary cable through the Snatch block system he'd rigged at the foundation anchors. The cable angle was 43 degrees from horizontal. Not ideal, but within working parameters for the four-part mechanical advantage he'd configured. He'd calculated his effective pull at 37,000 pounds against an estimated break-free load of 22,000. Margin enough to work with, not so much that he'd be careless about it. He climbed into the cab, engaged the PTO, let the winch take up the slack in the cable. When the line went taut, he felt it through the truck's frame, a vibration that traveled from the cable drum through the chassis and into the seat. He'd felt that vibration 10,000 times in 35 years. He knew what it meant. He began to pull. The Holmes 600 worm gear turned at a rate that would have tried the patience of anyone expecting speed. That was not what the worm gear was for. The worm gear was for torque, sustained, mechanical, indifferent to how long the load required. Rafe had set his pull rate to allow the cable angle to work through the steel's resistance, gradually rather than shock loading the connection points. Old rigging practice. The kind learned from men who'd pulled loads off mountain terrain, where a parted cable meant days of reset work at best and someone's death at worst. For 8 minutes, nothing visible happened at the pit. Craig Faust stood at the edge, watching the cable. His operators stood beside the Liebherr. Boyd Calhoun stood 10 feet back from the pit, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the Peterbilt. Then the steel moved. Not much. An inch, maybe two. But the sound that came with it, a deep, tearing groan as the wedge section broke its contact with the east wall, carried across the entire site and stopped every conversation. Denny Marsh took a step toward the pit edge. Craig raised one hand without looking back, the instinctive gesture of a man who wants witnesses to hold their position. The cable kept turning. The worm gear kept pulling. Rafe watched his gauges, watched his cable angle, made 2 small adjustments to his position by easing forward on the truck 6 inches, then 12, keeping the pull geometry clean as the steel rotated in the pit below. At 14 minutes, the debris section had separated 8 inches from the east wall. Craig could see daylight between the steel and the concrete, actual open space where the wedge had been locked for 6 days. He called his lead operator. "Get your load line ready. We're close." At 19 minutes, the section was free. Not all the way out, still in the pit, still needing the crane for the vertical lift, but no longer wedged, no longer locked at that impossible angle. It hung in the cable tension, rotating slowly, the load geometry now exactly what Rafe had said it would be, a straight vertical pull, no lateral complication, inside the Liebherr's working parameters. Rafe shut down the winch, set the brake, climbed out of the cab. He walked to the pit edge and looked down at where the steel hung in his rigging. He checked the cable connections, checked the foundation anchor chain, looked at the load angle one more time. "Your turn," he said to Craig. Craig's crew hooked the Liebherr's load line to the debris section in 4 minutes. Craig ran his lift sequence by the book, slow engagement, load test at 6 inches of travel, full commitment once the numbers confirmed. The Liebherr took the weight cleanly. The crane lifted the debris section out of the pit in 11 minutes, set it on the flat ground north of the elevator, and Craig's operator shut down the boom. Boyd Calhoun walked to the pit edge and looked down. The conveyor equipment below was damaged but accessible. His insurance adjuster could get in there now. His structural engineer could assess the walls. The 9-day wait was gone. The $210,000 secondary mobilization was gone. He stood there for a moment, looking at the concrete walls his grandfather had poured in 1947, then turned and walked toward Rafe, who was already back at the Peterbilt, beginning to break down his rigging. "Mr. Combs," Boyd said, "what do I owe you?" Rafe pulled his Snatch block free of the foundation chain, set it in the truck bed. "Nothing. That's not right. You saved me 9 days and $200,000. Boyd, I drove 14 miles and spent 2 hours. That's not a bill. That's a neighbor." "Then let me do something." Rafe looked at him. Pike County Volunteer Fire Department runs a rescue squad that covers this hollow. They've been trying to buy a thermal imaging camera for 3 years. $7,000. If you want to do something, do that. Boyd pulled out his phone and made a note. "Done. And Rafe, I want to pay you something directly. A fair rate." Rafe closed the tailgate on his truck bed. Your grandfather and my father worked the same seam in 51. Wallen's number 3. You know that. Boyd didn't know that. Went to the same church. Sat in the same pew. Your grandfather came to my father's funeral in 1969. Rafe picked up his cap from the hood of the Peterbilt and put it back on. You don't owe me a rate. You owe me nothing. That's what neighbors are for. Craig Faust had been standing nearby, close enough to hear. He waited until Boyd had walked back toward the elevator before he approached Rafe. I want to say something. Rafe waited. I've been running heavy lift for 19 years. I've got a crew of 12, equipment I paid $3 million for, and a client list that goes from here to Cincinnati. Craig stopped. I told that man to wait 9 days and spend $210,000 because I didn't know what you know about this terrain and this concrete and what a Holmes 600 can do at the end of a 4-part block. Rafe looked at him without expression. I'm not wrong about my equipment, Craig said. The Liebherr did the lift it was designed to do. But I was wrong about the problem. I defined the problem by what my equipment could do instead of what the job actually needed. He paused. That's a bad habit, and I've had it for a while without knowing it. Rafe considered that for a moment. Your grandfather ran a Peterbilt, Rafe said. He ever tell you why he kept it after the newer trucks came in? Said it never let him down. That's the whole answer, Rafe said. Truck that never lets you down is worth more than anything you can put a price on. He walked around to the driver's door of the Peterbilt, opened it, stopped with one hand on the mirror. You run good equipment, Craig. Learn the terrain it can't handle, and you'll never have to call a neighbor again. He climbed in. The engine started on the second crank. Word travels in Harlan County the way it always has, not through press releases or social media posts, but through the specific gravity of men telling other men what they saw with their own eyes. Denny Marsh told his brother-in-law, who ran a salvage operation in Lynch. Craig Faust told 2 operators he trusted, who told their crews. Boyd Calhoun told the structural engineer who came out to assess the elevator walls. And that engineer told a colleague in Whitesburg who'd been in the business long enough to remember when Holmes 600 booms were standard equipment on serious recovery trucks. Within 2 weeks, the story had a shape. Old man out of Everett's. 1949 Peterbilt. Bought for $425 at a salvage auction 35 years ago. Broke a wedge debris section free from 40-year-old concrete using a 4-part Snatch block system and a worm drive winch he'd rebuilt himself. Did the job in 19 minutes that a $680,000 crane couldn't solve in 4 days. The Pike County Volunteer Fire Department received a check from Boyd Calhoun for $7,000 3 days after the recovery. Their rescue squad captain called Boyd to confirm it wasn't a mistake. Boyd told him it wasn't. The thermal imaging camera arrived 6 weeks later. The caption on the department's Facebook post thanked an anonymous donor. Rafe never corrected that. A man from the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet called Rafe's number in September. He'd gotten it from the county road department, who'd gotten it from someone who knew Boyd. The cabinet man asked if Rafe did commercial recovery work and whether he'd be interested in a consulting arrangement for difficult terrain recoveries in the southeastern counties. Rafe told him he appreciated the call and that he didn't do consulting arrangements. The cabinet man asked what he did do. Rafe said he helped people when they needed it and that had always been enough of a business model for him. The cabinet man thanked him and hung up, and later told a colleague that he'd never been turned down quite so politely in 22 years of state work. Craig Faust drove out to Everett in October with a younger operator named Seth, 26 years old, 2 years into the recovery business. Craig had told Seth about the recovery. Not as a lesson exactly. Craig wasn't a man who framed things as lessons, but as a story worth knowing. They found Rafe in the barn, working on the Peterbilt's rear spring pack. A job that required patience and a press and an understanding of how leaf springs distribute load that most modern operators had never needed to develop. Seth watched Rafe work for an hour without saying much. At the end of it, he asked how Rafe had known the foundation concrete would hold the anchor load. Rafe looked up from the spring pack. Because I knew who built it. Seth didn't understand. Boyd's grandfather poured that foundation in 1947, Rafe said. I knew his grandfather's work. Knew what he used for aggregate, knew his mix ratios, knew he overbored his anchor holes and backfilled with hot lead before epoxy was standard practice. I wasn't guessing at the concrete. I was reading something I already knew how to read. Seth thought about that on the drive back to Lexington and was still thinking about it a week later when Craig asked him what was on his mind. Seth said he was thinking about the difference between knowing your equipment and knowing your terrain. Craig said that was exactly the right thing to be thinking about. The 1949 Peterbilt with the Holmes 600 boom went back under its canvas tarp in the east bay of Rafe's barn in late October. After Rafe had serviced the winch drum bearings and retensioned the cable and done the kind of post-job inspection that most people reserve for equipment that cost them something significant to acquire. Rafe did it because the truck deserved it, not because anyone was watching. There were two men who would have wanted to see that recovery and didn't live to. Rafe's father, who had taught him that terrain was always smarter than equipment, and that a man who understood the ground under his feet could move things that machines couldn't reach. And a recovery operator named Lonnie Sizemore, who'd worked the mountain roads of Leslie County for 40 years and had been the one to show Rafe, in 1979, how a 4-part Snatch block system multiplied pull force in ways that changed what a modest winch could accomplish. Lonnie had died in 2017. Rafe had been at the funeral and had stood at the graveside thinking that a certain kind of knowledge was leaving the county with every man of that generation, and that the only answer to that was to keep using it so it didn't disappear entirely. The Peterbilt was built in 1949 by men who understood that the roads it would travel weren't flat and that the loads it would pull weren't cooperative, and they had engineered accordingly. The Holmes 600 boom was designed for terrain work, for angles that broke the assumptions of highway recovery, for the kind of job where patience and mechanical advantage mattered more than horsepower and computerized load sensors. Nobody had built iron like that because it was cheap or easy. They'd built it that way because the work required it. And the work in Harlan County and Leslie County and the hollows between had not changed. Rafe Combs understood that. He had understood it since he was 15 years old watching his father rig a chain on a mountain road in the rain. He had kept understanding it through 50 years of work that nobody put a plaque on and nobody gave a ceremony for, because that was not the kind of work that came with ceremonies. It came with a truck that started when you needed it and a worm gear that held its load and a piece of iron that had been built by men who knew the difference between doing a job and doing it right. Boyd Calhoun drove past Rafe's property on his way to town every few weeks. Sometimes the barn doors were open and he could see the Peterbilt inside, that deep green paint, the Holmes boom angled up at rest. Sometimes the tarp was on and the doors were closed and the 11 acres looked like any other piece of Harlan County bottomland in the fall. Quiet, unremarkable, keeping its own counsel. Boyd always slowed down a little when he passed. He knew what was in that barn. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this story meant something to you, check out the other Iron Witnesses videos on your screen now. There's plenty more old iron with stories to tell. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I'll see you at the next one.